January 9th, 1945, 2:15 in the afternoon. Staff Sergeant Robert Martinez leads his reconnaissance squad through the abandoned Japanese military compound outside Manila, expecting to find the usual debris of retreat: abandoned equipment, scattered documents, perhaps wounded enemy soldiers requiring medical attention, or prisoner processing, according to Geneva Convention protocols that govern American treatment of captured personnel. Instead, Martinez discovers what appears to be a sophisticated medical facility, complete with examination rooms, medical supplies organized with military precision, and clean linens that suggest ongoing healthcare operations until very recently. The presence of Filipino women in the compound, perhaps 25 or 30, ranging in age from teenagers to women in their 30s, reinforces his assumption that he's encountered a Japanese field hospital staffed by local nurses who had been providing medical care to military and civilian personnel. The women's appearance supports Martinez's medical facility hypothesis. They are clean, reasonably well-dressed, and show signs of having been adequately fed, despite the food shortages that have affected most Filipino civilians during 3 years of Japanese occupation. Their behavior toward the approaching American soldiers suggests wariness rather than the relief that Martinez would expect from medical personnel who had been trapped in a combat zone. Martinez approaches the group with the professional courtesy that American military doctrine requires when dealing with medical personnel, even enemy medical personnel whose humanitarian functions are protected under international law. He raises his hands to indicate peaceful intentions and calls out in his limited Tagalog that his unit is there to provide assistance and ensure safe evacuation for civilian medical workers. One of the women, Maria Santos, a 23-year-old from Bataan, who had been deceived into the facility with promises of domestic work 8 months earlier, steps forward with obvious reluctance. Her English is better than Martinez's Tagalog, but she struggles to find words to explain circumstances that exist outside the vocabulary of normal military-civilian encounters. We are not. Maria begins, then stops, unable to complete the sentence that would reveal the true nature of the facility and her role in it. She cannot tell Martinez that this is not a hospital, that she and the other women are not nurses, that the medical supplies he sees are not used for treating patients, but for maintaining the systematic sexual slavery operation that the Japanese military had established throughout occupied Philippines territories. Maria's inability to explain stems not from language barriers, but from the recognition that revealing the truth about comfort stations might expose her and the other women to shame, rejection, or disbelief from American soldiers whose understanding of warfare did not include systematic sexual exploitation as a component of military logistics. Martinez interprets Maria's hesitation as trauma from combat exposure or fear of American intentions, responses he has encountered among civilian medical workers in other liberated areas. He assures her that American forces will protect civilian medical personnel and facilitate their return to normal healthcare activities once the immediate military situation has been stabilized. But Maria's fear has nothing to do with American intentions and everything to do with the impossibility of explaining that she and the other women have been victims of systematic sexual slavery disguised as military support services, imprisoned in a facility that appeared medical but served entirely different purposes than Martinez assumes. In liberation, soldiers expect to find victims of war. Combat zones produce predictable categories of civilian casualties: wounded people requiring medical attention, displaced families needing food and shelter, traumatized populations requiring protection from ongoing military operations. American military training had prepared Martinez to recognize and respond to these standard forms of wartime suffering. But sometimes, liberating forces discover crimes beyond imagination. Sometimes, the facilities that appear to serve normal military functions actually represent systematic atrocities that exist outside the expectations of soldiers whose own military culture operates within legal and moral frameworks that prohibit such activities. Sometimes, liberation becomes horrific recognition of institutional evil that challenges understanding about human capacity for organized cruelty. The comfort station system that the Japanese military had established throughout occupied Philippines territories represented one of the most extensive and systematic programs of sexual slavery in modern history. The system's effectiveness depended on deception, isolation, and presentation of sexual exploitation as legitimate military logistics rather than as the organized crime that it actually represented. Martinez's initial assumption that he had discovered a medical facility reflected American military expectations about the kinds of installations that military forces would establish in occupied territories. Hospitals, supply depots, administrative centers, communication facilities. These were the normal components of military occupation that American doctrine recognized and international law regulated. The possibility that a military installation might exist primarily for systematic sexual exploitation had not been included in Martinez's training because American military culture did not include institutional structures for organizing sexual slavery as military logistics. The concept existed outside American military experience and therefore outside American military expectations. The Filipino women trapped in the comfort station faced the impossible challenge of explaining their circumstances to American soldiers whose cultural and military background provided no framework for understanding systematic sexual slavery as military policy. The women's experiences existed in a category that American military training had not prepared Martinez to recognize or respond to appropriately. Maria's attempts to communicate with Martinez revealed the gap between American assumptions about military facilities and the reality of Japanese comfort station operations. The medical supplies that Martinez cataloged as evidence of healthcare activities were actually cleaning materials and contraceptives required by military health regulations designed to prevent disease transmission rather than to provide therapeutic medical care. Do you think Martinez's assumption that the facility was a hospital reflected his genuine ignorance about comfort station systems? Or do you think it reflected broader American military assumptions about the relationship between military occupation and civilian populations? Do you think some forms of systematic evil are literally unimaginable to people whose institutional experience operates within different moral frameworks? The misunderstanding about the facility's purpose began to unravel. When Martinez attempted to inventory medical supplies and discovered items that were inconsistent with normal hospital operations. Instead of surgical instruments, therapeutic medications, and diagnostic equipment, he found cleaning supplies, personal hygiene items, and contraceptive materials that suggested entirely different activities than medical treatment. More significantly, Martinez's conversations with the Filipino women revealed patterns of fear and trauma that were not consistent with medical personnel who had been providing healthcare services but which suggested victimization by systematic abuse. The women's reluctance to discuss their activities, their obvious terror at the prospect of explaining their circumstances, and their desperate concern about American reactions indicated experiences that went far beyond ordinary wartime medical service. The discovery of Japanese military records in the facility's administrative offices provided documentary evidence that confirmed Martinez's growing suspicions about the true nature of the installation. Japanese documents described comfort station operations, record-keeping procedures for tracking women's availability, and health regulations designed to maintain the efficiency of sexual exploitation, rather than to provide medical care. The documentation revealed the systematic nature of the operation in ways that individual testimony alone could not convey. Records showed the number of women processed through the facility, the military units that had been serviced, and the administrative procedures that had governed what the Japanese military classified as recreational logistics rather than sexual slavery. Martinez's recognition of the facility's true purpose created moral and practical challenges that his military training had not prepared him to handle. Standard procedures for dealing with liberated medical facilities were entirely inappropriate for responding to evidence of systematic sexual slavery and traumatized victims who required specialized care rather than routine humanitarian assistance. The Filipino women's responses to Martinez's growing understanding reflected complex mixtures of relief, terror, and shame that illustrated the psychological damage caused by months or years of systematic abuse. Their victimization had been compounded by isolation from normal social support systems and by presentation of their exploitation as voluntary service rather than criminal coercion. Maria's gradual revelation of her circumstances required Martinez to confront realities about warfare and human behavior that challenged fundamental assumptions about military conduct and international law. The recognition that enemy military forces had operated systematic sexual slavery as standard logistics forced Martinez to expand his understanding of war crimes beyond combat atrocities to include institutional sexual exploitation. The other women in the facility began sharing their experiences as they recognized that American personnel might provide protection rather than simply returning them to Japanese custody or abandoning them to uncertain fate. Their collective testimony revealed the scope and organization of comfort station operations in ways that individual accounts could not convey. Martinez found himself documenting not just liberation activities, but war crimes evidence that would eventually contribute to post-war tribunals and historical recognition of systematic sexual slavery as a component of Japanese military operations throughout occupied territories. His role expanded from tactical reconnaissance to historical witness in ways that his training had not anticipated. The medical examination of the women, conducted by American medical personnel who were summoned to the facility, revealed physical evidence of systematic abuse that confirmed the testimony about comfort station operations. The medical findings provided objective documentation that supported survivor accounts and demonstrated the institutional nature of the sexual exploitation. The transformation of Martinez's understanding from assumed medical facility to recognized war crimes site required him to develop new categories for understanding military occupation and civilian victimization. The comfort station represented a form of systematic abuse that existed outside normal expectations about military-civilian relationships during wartime occupation. The broader implications of the discovery extended beyond individual cases to systematic documentation of Japanese comfort station operations throughout the Philippines and recognition of sexual slavery as a war crime that required institutional rather than individual response. Martinez's reports became part of American military documentation of Japanese war crimes. The women who had been imprisoned in the comfort station faced the challenge of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by experiences that most people could not understand or acknowledge. Their liberation required not just physical freedom, but also social recognition of their experiences as war crimes, rather than personal shame or voluntary service. Martinez's discovery became part of a larger pattern of American military encounters with comfort station facilities throughout the Pacific Theater, revealing the systematic nature of Japanese sexual slavery operations and the need for specialized procedures for dealing with survivors of institutionalized sexual abuse. The documentation that Martinez initiated contributed to post-war legal proceedings and historical recognition of comfort women as victims of systematic war crimes rather than voluntary participants in military recreation. His testimony helped establish the institutional nature of sexual slavery as military policy rather than individual criminal behavior. After the war, Maria and the other Filipino women returned to communities that were often unprepared to acknowledge or support survivors of systematic sexual abuse. Their reintegration required not just personal healing, but also social recognition that their experiences represented victimization rather than collaboration with enemy forces. Martinez returned to civilian life carrying knowledge about systematic sexual slavery that would affect his understanding of warfare, military responsibility, and the relationship between institutional authority and individual conscience. His encounter with the comfort station had expanded his recognition of human capacity for both evil and survival. The facility where Martinez had made his discovery was eventually converted to serve Filipino civilians who were receiving medical treatment and social services during the post-war Reconstruction period. The building that had housed systematic sexual slavery became a legitimate medical facility providing health care to people recovering from various forms of wartime trauma. The transformation of the physical space from comfort station to actual hospital represented broader changes in Philippine society, as American liberation replaced Japanese occupation and systematic exploitation gave way to efforts at humanitarian assistance and national reconstruction. The story of Martinez's misidentification of the comfort station as a hospital became part of post-war education about systematic sexual slavery and the importance of recognizing institutionalized sexual exploitation as a war crime rather than a cultural practice or military necessity. Historical documentation of comfort station operations eventually included testimony from American personnel, like Martinez, who had encountered evidence of sexual slavery during the liberation of Japanese-occupied territories. Their reports provided crucial corroboration for survivor testimony that might otherwise have been dismissed or minimized by people who found such systematic abuse difficult to believe or acknowledge. The medical records that Martinez had initially interpreted as evidence of healthcare operations became part of historical documentation about the comfort station system, illustrating how systematic sexual exploitation had been disguised as legitimate military logistics through careful record-keeping and institutional procedures. In the end, the facility that had appeared to be a hospital became evidence of systematic war crimes that challenged comfortable assumptions about military conduct and institutional authority. The liberation that had begun with expectations of finding medical personnel became recognition of survivors whose experiences demanded justice rather than simply humanitarian assistance. The misunderstanding that had made systematic sexual slavery appear to be medical care revealed the careful institutional deception that had allowed organized abuse to operate behind facades of legitimate military logistics and administrative efficiency. If stories like this make you think about the systematic evil that disguises itself as institutional normalcy, about the survivors whose experiences challenge our comfortable assumptions about warfare and military conduct, about the liberation that reveals crimes beyond imagination hiding behind administrative efficiency, then perhaps you understand why some discoveries change everything. We think we know about human capacity for institutional evil, why some liberations become recognition of systematic atrocities, and why the most important medical care sometimes involves treating wounds that institutions inflicted while pretending to provide entirely different services.